It's been a privilege to get to know Reverend Galen Gobin from Forest Lawn in the process of planning this event. And I have come to know him as a man of deep faith and deep compassion. And he is an ordained minister himself and is the director of clergy services and grief support director at Forest Lawn. And he's going to come and bring up our panelists and moderate this time and close out the day for us. Would you please welcome Reverend Galen Gobin? Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here today. I'm so thrilled so many of you have shown up today. It is a passion of mine. I went through seminary and didn't learn anything about grief. Nothing was required of me. And I will ask, without raising of hands, how many of you did the same thing? And seeing a few smiles, I know that that's a somewhat standard experience. And then you get put into a parish somewhere, and you get to figure things out. And that's not always easy to do. I was blessed, I was lucky. God gave me a heart to be with people, which I think is why you all are here today. Because you too have the same heart, which I greatly appreciate. And it's good to be in a room with as we say in ADEC, the professional association I'm a part of, my tribe. Folks that get it. When you can talk about death, you can talk about loss, you can talk about sorrow, and you know, people don't look at you and go, "Oh, really?" and step away. So it is really good to be here with you all today. My great thanks to Chris and to the whole staff, APU, and to the staff for the Center for Vocational Ministries, because without their work, we wouldn't be here. We'd be in our own places today. And I am grateful for this relationship as we begin to grow and hopefully see where it can go in the future. Because grief, as you've learned today, I suspect, is this incredibly broad kind of experience that touches us in so many different places and leads to, if we work with it, a really rich life. Not easy life, but a rich one. And so I'm just really pleased that we're able to give you the opportunity today to learn a little bit about that, to go back to help in that process of tikkun olam, to restitch the world, and to touch people in small ways, because as we heal the world, as Christ calls us to do, as we heal the world, then it's a brighter place. And we're just a little step closer. So I'd like to bring our panelists up here now. That's enough with my statements and things. I'd like to bring our panelists up here and everything. Michelle Post and Dr. Kenneth Polite, and again, Dr. Harold Ivan Smith, if they would take seats up here. And I'm going to let each one of them, well, Harold Ivan, you've heard all morning, but I'm going to let Michelle and Dr. Polite tell a little bit about themselves, who they are, and I hope that you are drawing questions already and emailing those in quickly here and soon, because we've got a rich afternoon.
So I found out recently in 1972 it was no longer illegal for women to wear pants in public, and because these chairs are very high, I'm appreciative of that law. Okay, so full disclosure, I have biases. I'm also a sinner, so anybody without sin who would like to throw a stone, feel free. Okay. I'm actually a dreaded preacher's daughter. Grew up apostolic, Pentecostal, fundamental. So I with lots of therapy, I know most of my biases and where they come from. So just, take what you like and leave the rest. And then I became Presbyterian over time, so I have some exposure to multiple faiths. But my practice is as a licensed marriage and family therapist in West LA. And I also oversee our bereavement department at OneLegacy, which is the Southern California organ, eye, and tissue donation agency. So I can answer some questions about pastoral care and organ donation or that kind of thing. Children's grief, suicide prevention and postvention, and stress management and self-care are my areas of strength.
I'm Dr. Kenneth Polite. I'm the Executive Director of the Ulmer Institute. And I'm going to show you a little film. It'll tell you about the Ulmer Institute. A little bit about me. I am on the executive committee of Faithful Central Bible Church, which is one of the mega churches in LA. We don't do numbers anymore because they say pastors count by threes, and, and numbers just get very, very kind of crazy. But we minister to at least about 8,000 people a month. I'm also the director of the Champion Counseling Center, and we serve about 200 individuals per month. And we train psychologists and marriage and family therapy associates, a new term beginning this January. They used to be interns. They are now marriage and family associates. We currently have about 15 associates that are being trained with us. Why don't you go ahead and play the TUI tape?
How many of you know people that have been injured or have died because of gang violence?
Authorities say a man with a gun checked in at the office and headed straight to a classroom. He shot and killed a female teacher, and 2 young students were shot.
Everybody around me just screamed, and we just all ran, and we just didn't know what to do. We thought somebody might have had like a gun or something.
The Ulmer Institute was birthed out of a passion to heal hidden hurts. The young kid who sees his brother killed but did not get killed. The mother who watches her son blown away in a drive-by shooting. The woman, the boy, the girl who shot himself and yet thrives and lives beyond it, but lives with bullet holes and memories, even holes in their spirit, holes in their mind. How can they be healed? How can they be helped? It was this kind of passion that birthed the Ulmer Institute.
In the 40 years that I've been doing clinical work, one of the most fascinating things that I've seen is that trauma hides. In a study we did a couple of years ago with an N of 900, one of the most interesting things that we found was that people didn't ascribe to having experienced trauma, but when you put traumatic events in front of them, they subscribe from 7 to 16 traumatic events, but they didn't see it as trauma. They saw it as a part of their normal lives.
So the Ulmer Institute came to our church, and with the training from the program, I was able to, get myself in the right mindset and look out for people who could help me and try to get help as I can, not push people away.
I'm actually very thankful that we got to sit in and listen to all this information, because just last week ago, I actually seen someone get shot right in front of me. There was a guy walking and lurking on girls, and he shot one of the girls and took off in the car with a baby. When I seen this, it actually made me think, like, this training that we already had, I had to refer back to it. I wanted to stress the importance of being there for her, that there was help on the way, that we were gonna get out the situation, rather than her freaking out or passing out or anything that could have happened if I wasn't there in the situation.
I walked downstairs, got in the car like normal, and I proceeded to get in the car, and I heard some scuffling in the back. And I looked over my shoulder, and I saw him in the back seat with a gun and a pillow. And so my first instinct was to try to barter with him and try to get out of the situation. And then for whatever reason, I just got out of the car and started running. And so he's chasing me, and at the time he was shooting, but he was missing. The first bullet hit me in the breast. And at that point, I realized that this was serious, like he was seriously trying to kill me. So I think that we do have a couple of issues at hand, and especially for me, I feel, because I am of color, in our community, it's looked upon, it's looked down upon for us to go to therapy and counseling. Then being a believer, people feel as though, well, you go to church, you go to a really good church that's teaching the word, and I'm sure you've had people lay hands on you and pray for you and yada, 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 so why are you still dealing with this issue? This was my husband. This was not some random person, that walked down the street and, accidentally shot me. This was my husband of 5 years that literally chased me down, shot at me over 30 times, and hit me 3 times.
People in faith communities will first come to their pastor or rabbi because that's who they trust, that's who they know, that's who knows them. And to be the first responder, the person that people call when somebody dies, when somebody's killed. But to also have that be in your own neighborhood as a pastor, where you have both the direct exposure and the constant indirect exposure. Pastors need to recognize in themselves, to care for themselves, to be able to manage caring for others over the long haul. And so we're hoping to partner, with gathering groups of clergy, rabbis, folks that are faith leaders, to understand how to intervene early with others, as well as monitor their own trauma exposure and traumatic stress symptoms in themselves, and know when they need help, and even be able to provide a network of people where they can go to get some help and support when they need it.
In Chicago, we have more killings and shootings now in 1 month than we've had since the 90s right now in Chicago. We got to deal with it. You look at whole communities that are abandoned, not just neglected, abandoned. They talk about 5% unemployment in America. That tells me where I live, I'm not part of America. Because I got over 20% in my community. I have lack of economic development, lack of jobs, underfunded schools, boarded up houses, most coming back from prison. You create the perfect storm for this. There's whole communities that look like third world countries. It's a war zone where people live every day.
We have a team of men from the church going to North Avenue now to pull back those young people who are absolutely out of control, so that we can bring some order. This is a peaceful movement, and we plan on maintaining that order.
Law enforcement officials presented evidence collected from Dylan Roof's car.
Of course, it didn't take long for it to get around the congregation. The Morris Brown was one of the churches on the list.
A place of worship in his workplace, a potential target, but the Reverend says his faith calls on him to continue to be fearless.
Our concern, our focus, our desire is to treat trauma, to train others to do trauma, and to do research for future generations as to how this phenomenon can be dealt with successfully and prosperously. That's what we're called to. That's what we're all about.
You might ask yourself, what does trauma have to do with grief? As Chris said on the film, as pastors, you are first responders to trauma. There's a concept that I want to raise with you. It's the concept of vicarious trauma. We've found that exposure to people who are dealing with trauma creates trauma for the listener. It's just critical that as pastors, you do good self-care. You might think, I haven't lost anybody in my family. There's no immediate grief for me, but when you're dealing with other people's grief, that grief impacts you, and you've got to do good self-care. I found the discussion this morning just wonderful. It raised lots of thoughts for me, and just a couple of quick comments. There was reference made to the need to build a cogent memory of a traumatic incident. The reason you need a cogent memory is the hallmark of PTSD is that the person is overwhelmed, they don't form a cogent memory of what happened, and then it plays over and over again in a loop. So if you've got a cogent memory, it actually helps to prevent PTSD. Another thought that came up for me, the number of marriages that occur when couples lose a child, because men and women grieve so differently. And as pastors, you need to be aware of that and help the couple to give one another permission to grieve differently. Men and women don't grieve the same. And I forget what the statistic is, but it's an alarming statistic. If a couple loses a child, they typically wind up divorcing, and it has to do with that difference. I'm looking forward to the discussion, so I'll pass the mic.
Well, keep the mic over there.
Oh, okay.
They've given me this one here, and Dr. Polite, I'm gonna call you Kenneth. I'm more comfortable that way, and all. What you talking about the vicarious trauma makes me think a little bit about the world that we all live in, and let's just kind of start there with the constant daily bombardment, and I'll use that word on purpose, from all kinds of media outlets and resources, from things, just CNN, CBS, our local kinds of outlets, as well as the things that we carry around here that we're all connected to and all. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And then we'd like to hear Michelle respond some with that too, or just both of you, the other two panelists, about what that is doing with us today.
I think you have people who have PTSD and they got it from CNN. I do a lot of fundraising in Jewish communities, and I say to the audience, you can sit in your gated community feeling safe and comfortable and wind up with PTSD just watching what's going on the news. I think we tend to think of trauma, especially violent trauma, as something that's relegated to poor communities or Black and brown communities. Trauma is ubiquitous. It pushes in on all of us. And the TV is one of the ways that it happens.
Yeah. Michelle, do you ever?
I just want to invite you to reach out for some free resources. If you Google the Compassion Fatigue Pro QOL, it is a self-scoring tool that you could use for yourself, your parishioners, anybody you counsel. And it will talk about compassion fatigue, which I think is a risk factor for all clergy, pastors, therapists, nurses, anyone that helps anyone. On my own website, there's a slightly different free one. My website's just Michelle, MICHELLE, -post.com. There's a resource tab, and there is a downloadable burnout survey that I've been using with mostly emergency responders, nurses, et cetera, for many, many years, finding that the average American scores in the medium amount danger zone of burnout. I think I have about 750 people that have taken it so far. So that's free. I use that all the time. Feel free to use that. I love exactly what you said. Trauma is not a definable, oh, you must have witnessed a shooting, murder, crime, etc. Trauma is all about this perception of one's danger. So it doesn't even have to be an actual quote-unquote classic violent thing. It can be the perception of your own danger that can trigger vicarious trauma. So you hearing about something in your congregation or with somebody you're working with or on CNN can easily expose you to vicarious trauma. One of the risk factors is working in a small community or a very specialized area. And I think when you're in the work of spiritual counseling, that is its own rural community in the middle of a large metropolis.
As a former dean and an academician and a practicing clinical psychologist, I have really good boundaries. I know what I can handle. I know when to say no. I know when my plate is full. As a pastor, those boundaries don't work quite as well. I find it much more difficult as a pastor to say no, even when I know I should say no. So I can't push enough. Pastoral self-care, when it comes to these issues, you've got to do it. You've got to find folks that will help you do it. If you're pastoring and you don't have anyone that you can dump on, pray and get someone. You have to have someone that you can share with.
I think it's critical with the increased expectations that are on pastors. I look at some pastors' responsibilities and go, how can you live with this? Because you've got to deliver the goods. The bigger the church gets, the more your reputation. You have got to deliver the goods. And that can't be done. There's only X number of hours in a week. And I think elder boards need to say, we need to think through this. What are we expecting of you? That's an excellent question, yeah. I want to expand on something Keith said. Kenneth. Well, Keith too, wherever Keith.
Look, when you got a name like Galen, names are important.
Yeah. I have chosen not to have a TV. And I'm one of the few in the world, apparently. And you know, it has been good. I've also chosen to regulate the radio as well. There were years I had to have radio on, you know, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock news and all that kind of stuff. And my day would be around, this dates me, getting home to watch Walter Cronkite. What I worry about, and it's close, is that there's not really enough news to fill 24 hours a day. And yet it sells. So people see a show at 8 o'clock, then they go to the top of the hour, and they keep, and so basically they're seeing a lot of the same thing. If they get up in the middle of the night and flip the TV on, which people do, what do they see? The same thing they saw, which the brain is interpreting as, this is everywhere, this is just happening everywhere, which raises that threat level. And I think the other thing is that just having the sound of it somewhere. I did a self-care program teaching for one of our large hospitals in Kansas City, and one of the surgeons was brilliant, that they do not turn the radio on the way to work. And when they come out of the hospital, they do not turn the radio on until they get home. That's a time to transition, and I really respected them for it. It's that sense of and it's like the dog that's running up and down the yard and wearing out the grass. We hear those stories over and over, and then we exchange them, and it's almost like cotton candy. Oh, I'll tell you what I heard. I heard this, and now you keep throwing more elements into the narrative. And we later find out some of those elements aren't true. They were not quite correct. So the media and trauma is a huge issue. Who to believe, how much to listen.
Yeah, I think that's important. Two quick thoughts I would add to what they're all saying. One of he's not mine, one of the memorial counselors who works at Forest Lawn's been there doing this work for almost 30 years. And every day, 3 times a day, approximately, he steps into a room with a family who is bereaved, all different kinds of ways, you know, and all different kinds of loss. It may be a child, it may be grandma who died at 104, it may be, you know, a gunshot wound or whatever. And I asked him when I got there, I said, so what do you do? How have you done this for so long? And I've been doing my work now at Forest Lawn for almost 11 years. And he said, as I leave at the end of the day, throw my coat over the arm, and I unhook my tie, just kind of loosen my tie and undo my top button and walk out the door. And that is a physical signal to me, this is over. And now I'm transitioning to a different place. And at first I was like, you know, oh, well, what can that do? And then I began to understand and realize how much those physical signals do, you know, what our body does, you know, through trauma and stuff. And we, good night, Christians are awful about the importance of the body. I'll just say that there right now. But he uses his body to help him transition. And I would also point out to you that Jesus, for self-care, took his body and went out and went away. He did things for himself. He spent time alone. He cared for himself and what he understood that he needed so that he could come back and give. Unless you have got something in your well, you got nothing. You got to take care of yourself. And that's something that I was very poor at in 15 years as a parish minister. And I'm getting a little bit better, thank you, Michelle, in my work now with Forest Lawn.
I just want to make a shameless plug for pastors' kids and spouses. I met one today at lunch. Maybe your spouse already knew you were going to be a pastor before you got together, and maybe it happened after. Your children definitely did not know what they were going to be born into. And just like you said, it's hard to have those boundaries with your parishioners. Your children's stuff gets missed. It's a difficult life. They didn't choose it. and it's a struggle to maintain a connection to God. So I highly recommend, I just heard Doug's center does some pretty specific counseling with pastors, pastors' families, pastors' spouses. But there's also this belief like you can't tell your dirty laundry or your parents are gonna get fired, right? No one gets to know all the dirty stuff that happens at home, and nor should they. So, but they need an outlet because we're not perfect. We're, pastors and pastors' wives and pastors' children are not perfect. So if you've got that going on or you see that in colleagues, encourage them to also get their own care for their extended family.
Yeah.
The woman who was being chased by her husband, who was being shot, he was a pastor.
Oh.
An instance of complicated grief with a pastor. He had lost his church. He was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and his marriage was a shambles. And he was grieving and not doing very well with it, and literally wound up trying to kill his wife and committed suicide by cop. Pastors are people too, and pastors have grief. And they've got to deal with their grief in appropriate ways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to pull us through to a question here, and I'd like all of you to answer this, but I want to start with Michelle in particular. Last week, speaking of the media and all, last week, we watched the students at Parkland High School, Dorothy Stoneman, whatever it is, return to school. And they return to school as they walk in there, and here's all of these military-style police and all their guns and things. They're coming back into a place that the last time they left it was a very traumatic situation. And I'm wondering if you'll talk a little bit about, the potential or the possibility of our need as a society to prove to be strong, while at the same time then the potential for, or is there potential for re-traumatizing those kids and the staff and the teachers and the other students as they, and parents as they walk back into that. Any thoughts?
Yes.
Long question.
Yeah, okay, so yes, there's the potential for, I'm sure you're gonna add to this and correct me if I go off track. There's the potential to re-traumatize people after a traumatic shooting incident. Grief counselors are not needed. Trauma interventionists are needed. Galen and I have a good colleague out of Chapman University and Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Annette Iverson, who worked with Columbine after they sent in the grief counselors on the first round who did everything wrong, and realized that what the local community really needed was children to be with other children and families to be with other families in coffee shop type settings to discuss and create the cogent narrative about the incident. I have, unfortunately, am working with a family that's a Vegas shooting survivor family, and have colleagues that were there and survived or shot themselves, that every new shooting re-traumatizes the previous shootings or national incidences group. So I have someone in my private practice from the Aurora shooting who was triggered by the Vegas shooting and then re-triggered again by the more recent shooting, and it just becomes very overwhelming for them. So we put them on a news diet. They're no longer allowed to watch the news. I'm glad you mentioned that. We do a lot of decreasing the anxiety and helping them to cope with the anxiety. I tend to use systematic desensitization training, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention, but I love EMDR. I'm just not trained in EMDR. Highly recommend it. I see great results in it, and I refer to it all the time. This is not something I would expect a pastor to be able to do. I would highly recommend that a pastor get a professional who, when there is trauma, that they are seeking counseling services and you are their adjunct support to help them deal with their spiritual crises. But yes, they can get re-traumatized by all kinds of new stories.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's fairly common that they do become re-traumatized. Trauma, a real simple thumbnail definition of trauma, it's when you don't have enough resources to balance the scale, when you're overwhelmed by what's going on. Does that sound like ministry to anybody? When you don't have enough resources and the scales are unbalanced. You kicked up a thought and I lost it in terms of, it'll come back. Good.
I think, too, with trauma, it is that scripture that says, in such a moment as you think not, you are at a concert, you are relaxed, you are enjoying, and that is the moment the craziness happens. And I think it's leading us to this type of vigilance. We're on guard all the time. And it's like tightening your muscles up. I don't think you can go around all day with your muscles tight. And I think it's the outrageousness of some of those moments. How could that happen? I wish I knew, because it's kind of like, well, if you knew you were going to a situation, what could you expect? But in so many, it's like the church down in Texas several months ago, the last place you'd think about things happen. And I think there's part of that is working through the trauma that in the place I least thought it would happen, it happened. And there's something about that I don't fully understand, but there's something going on there. Yeah, there should be all these safe places, but even safe places kind of like a 1 to 10 scale now.
Yeah. It came back. The thing that most psychologists and social workers and MFTs would do in a situation is exactly the wrong thing. What we have a tendency to do based on our training is to push the emotion. How do you feel? What's going on with you? Which actually is re-traumatizing. In the midst of that kind of thing, you don't need to be that focused on the emotion. It's kind of what you referred to, what happens next? What happened before? What's going on now? What are you going to do next? Not pushing the emotion so much.
And it is, I have to admit, great PR for a school board. Counselors are there. Yeah, and it's like they barely have got the shooter covered, and they're announcing the grief counselor, we're loading up buses. And, it's and sometimes they're, are you going? Are you going? No, I'm not going. I'm not trained. That's not my area of training. Now, a year from now, maybe I can be of use. But this sense of sending the brigade, here come the Marines, storming the gates.
Let's ask a question that came in that didn't show up on my iPad. I'm not sure why, but we've got a bunch of them, so we'll try to work through some of these here. But here's an excellent one. How do we get others, lay people, in the congregation to walk alongside others in their grief? If everyone went to the lead pastor, do they not? That's all we'd be doing. So can you talk to that a little bit about maybe spreading some of this grief out to find some people that can help pastors in their congregations? They're great community organizations, but what about within the congregation themselves?
One of the things that we've done at Faithful Central Bible Church is we took some of our lay people, sent them for grief training. I think Glendale Hospital has a really good program. And then had them come back, and now 3 workshops a year and 4 check-ins a year. They do grief workshops for the congregation. So that's one of the ways of spreading it out.
Similarly, our house in the West LA, I think they do a 3-day training for people. Dee Dee Hirsch, which I work with from time to time, they do an excellent 2-day applied suicide intervention skills training for lay people, just because 1 in 20 people at any given time are thinking of suicide. So that's an excellent skill to just create a kind of subcommittee. One of the churches I was with for a long time, we had a subcommittee that was part of the deacon board, where certain people were trained in certain types of things, so that it wasn't just about bringing a casserole to the family who was bereaved, but it was also that they had some basic skills. So I think it's just a matter of, you will have people that are called to serve. It's a matter of putting the call out to your congregation on a regular basis and connecting them to training, and then seeing if they'll give back. We had, lay people leading our groups. I do not know or really love Grief Share, so if you love it, I apologize, but it is one of the programs out there that is spirit-based, that is short-term, that is video-led, that is curriculum-led. I hate to put it out there because it's not my favorite, but it is a resource out there where you can send your congregation to get training, and then they can bring it back and provide a community resources. It's also a great way to tell your community, if it's not just about serving your congregation, if your congregation is small, you can put it out to your community that you're holding a grief support group at your church, and it's a way of letting the community know that you care about them.
The D.D. Hirsch program is so good. I brought them in to train my psychologists in training. I enjoyed it so much that I opened it up to all of the pastors and ministers at the church, and they all found it really helpful.
You don't have anything to...
Tell me the question again.
Basically, how do we involve our community, so that our congregations, so that we as pastors are not the only ones trying to do this?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you. How to say this gently and kindly, but I think we have moved into spectator faith. You show up, and when I grew up, it was a small church, I admit that, but you had all these hats you had to wear because to get something done. And now it's like I choose. And so I come on Sunday mornings, and the music was good, praise and worship was good, and then I'm off. It's a check off. But this sense of saying, and in some of these, how do you know even who people are? And yet you're supposed to come walking into their life and say, tell me about what you're going through. I think church has grown so big that we face it. It's like what's the difference in the big box stores, big box churches? And I worry because remember the theme to Cheers, where everybody knows your name, everybody's glad you came, and how does it? I'm on tape. I can't say that then, but it's helping them understand historically this is what the work was. We are called to come alongside people. In the New Testament, it's the paraclete, the one who comes alongside us, and deputizing. And maybe we have over-credentialed, with our degrees and that sort of thing. But just to realize, my great song that I love is "Lean On, O King Eternal." And when they get to the verse, "For not with swords loud clamor, or stir of roaring drum, in deeds of love and kindness, the heavenly kingdom comes." And I love those phrases. It's in deeds of love and kindness. And how do we teach people to trust and go with it?
Yeah, Dr. Thomas Long in his book "Accompany Them with Singing." If you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to pick that up. Does a history of the church and around death and funerals and things, particularly the early church. And one of the things that he says there that led to the incredible explosion of Christian faith was the fact that they were so different about caring for the dead and caring for families that people looked at him and went, I need to know some more about this. And I think that that's really instructive for us, because we as a society are really moving and stretching away from our dead. I've got a couple of friends of mine here who are involved with mortuaries also, and they see much of what we do at Forest Lawn, and that is an incredible rise in what we call direct interment, where people are walking in and they're saying, okay, mom's still at the hospital, you pick her up, this is what I want done with her, you bury her, and we'll hold something later. Maybe. And that's foolish.
I think that there's a really bigger issue. We're resurrection people for about 2 weeks a year. And the other 50 weeks, we're in death anxiety. And if anybody ought to be able to deal with death, it ought to be the faith. And you mentioned about the early Christians. That was the power. Death has lost its power over. It can no longer control us. And I think that's lost in organized Christianity. Do everything possible you can, keep them on the machines, try this, all those things. And I get this all the time. Oh, I could never do what you do. And then they go, no, why? How? And I go, well, I'll tell you how we can do it. What? We are paid so much money to do it. And I've had them say, well, I knew there was some reason you could do it. I said, it is scandalous what we make doing this kind of work. Yes. And they just go off, then but it's this, and I go, 200 years ago, you would have done. We all did this. Yeah. The funeral industry was not organized. You worked in these work teams in the churches and communities. But now there is this fear. You're a mirror to me. And yes, I believe in heaven, but I just don't want to go this afternoon. And so I need to draw the drapes on you because your trauma tells me that same trauma could happen to me. Yep. And I just want to draw the drapes. God bless you, and I'll pray for you. I hate that phrase. My prayers and thoughts are with you. And that was used 4,000 times in Congress. And I go, well, maybe it'd be easier just to do some praying. Yeah. Let's try it. Maybe not just saying my thoughts and prayers. And I really thought a lot about this idea of if death comes, I've got a lot of things I still want to accomplish, but I have such certainty in my faith that Christ has been with me here, and the transition to whatever it's going to be, and I don't know all the details, is going to be all right because he will be there. Yeah. And this fear that's still there, I think two other fears that are part of it. I think there's a big fear of the pain. I'm going to be in pain. I'm going to end up in diapers, talking out of my head. I'm not going to be anything like I've been all these years. And I think a little bit another fear is the fear of being forgotten. Now, if I have a lot of money, I can come and talk to the development people here at APU, and I got $5 million in the trunk of the car. What can I get? Oh, we got a new building. Put your name on the side of the building. How big are the letters going to be? Are they going to be lit? I'd prefer lit. But I guarantee...
You can do that now in California.
Yeah. I guarantee you there are students on this campus who've been here 3 or 4 years. You can walk them by. Who was that building? Who was that name for? Somebody in accounting. And, here's the reality. We're going to be forgotten. That is the scary thing. Except Jesus says, you will never be forgotten. You are mine. And I think we've got to help people. How could you grab a hold of some of that? You're not going to be forgotten. Let me add one more dimension.
Okay, and then Kenneth gets to talk.
Yes, all right. Yeah. Well, Keith, I want to hear from Keith. Not having children. There's no heirs. There's none of that. And so I do spend a lot of time thinking about who is going to remember me. Did I leave any footprints? But I've had some married people tell me with all kinds of kids, you can't trust your kids are going to come through for you, or they're going to be there for you. And you see this sometimes in addiction, where the person is grieving the years I was into my substance, I wasn't with dad, I wasn't around mom. I'm now grieving for those years when I could. But we don't talk about it enough. Will I be remembered? Yeah.
I heard the question is, how do we spread the work of the ministry out to the people? And I think there are two things that pastors can do that can really help with that. Teach on discipleship and push small groups.
Yeah. One of the last thoughts I would add to this to pick up on something you mentioned, Harold Ivan, is it sounds strange, I know, but I'm privileged to work in a cemetery. It's where my office is. And when I get out from behind my desk and take the opportunity to go walking through the park, for one, it's beautiful there. I'm lucky about that. Secondly, as I walk along the streets and things, I look out at the tablets that are there. And when you see the tablets, and my faith, my theology says, I may be reading their names, I got no idea who these people are. But in reading them, in seeing and connecting with that person, I don't know what their life is or anything, but I do believe God does. And they are not forgotten. And so many of us anymore are, again, back to that sense of direct cremation, direct interment, no, we don't want anything, we're going to scatter and stuff. And scattering's fine. That's not an issue. But more and more, we're seeing people who need to come back then and do something with a tablet or some kind of marker, because there's something permanent. We human beings need that sense of solidity, that something is permanent here, and a marker will do that. It may not be a family member, because within 2 generations, everybody who's alive who knows you will be dead. That's just a fact. But there are others who will read, and at least in the name, again, and I believe, in those stories that those people live. And I think that's really important. And then, sorry, I think most of us are preachers or up here, and I've heard Michelle do everything but preach in a specific situation. You wouldn't call it that, and all, but it's on, and all, but if you don't, when you leave here today, if you don't have something to preach on Sunday during Lent, good God, wake up. Because I asked a question one time. I get to be a part of ministers' groups around our various forest lawns. And I asked a question one time, I was going through and saying, so how many of you have ever preached on death outside of a funeral? One guy. One guy raised his hand out of 4 different groups. We have a faith that comes out of death. It comes out of the tomb. And if it didn't, then you're not reading the same Bible I do. Take the opportunity to preach about death, to preach about end of life, to preach about these things together. That is one of the best ways that you can begin to draw those people who are invested. That's the word I like to use. Invested in the end of life, invested in some kind of way that they understand their faith can go forward. That you can begin to draw those people to it, because when you mention it, it probably hasn't been mentioned before, except for in a funeral, and then we're here only for that one thing, and then we come back the next Sunday and everything's normal again. But draw those people to yourself in that way. And I think you can find a whole community who will then support you and be interested in doing this work. One of the other questions that's here is in talking about working with teens and children and things. And I know, Michelle, this is a real area of importance for you. And I'll talk about the difference between teens and adults and children. We're fine.
Okay. Children do grieve, and it looks very different than adults, so I'll start there. They don't have a sense of permanence. So one moment they will tell the grocer, my dad died, and then they'll walk outside to the car and ask mom, when's dad coming home? Because if they're under about 8-ish, that's when their brain is still on that, they forget things, and they don't have a sense of object permanence and irreversibility, that kind of thing, Piaget's concepts. So they have to be told multiple times that someone has died and how, so they can grow into the knowledge, use the real words. Death, died, dead, not lost, past. Gone to heaven means nothing to them. It's up in the clouds. They take a plane. They don't see their parent. Depression sets in. Be very careful about explaining to children in concepts that are metaphorical. They need literal. The body stopped working. That means they don't breathe or see or hear or eat or feel. But our family believes whatever your your faith believes, which is that we'll see them again, when we also die, that kind of thing. And that's still going to be hard for them to get. And then teenagers, and I say teenagers tend to last into 23 to 25, sometimes age 27, because of brain development. The prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until the mid to late 20s, depending on your gender and your biology. So a young adult who's making full-on decisions about giving birth, getting married, owning a car, getting a gun, going to the military, is still operating much more like an adolescent in their brain than a 30-year-old. So they're going to grieve also like a teenager, which means that they will tend to look for their peers who maybe have or have not experienced a death of someone close. They may take more risks. They may try to numb out more using substances or staying too busy, or just white knuckle it for about a decade until they end up in someone's office like mine and are finally ready at age 38 to talk about how their mom died when they were 17. So get them in a support group of people their own age, or a camp. Things like Comfort Zone Camp as a resource for children and teens. Things like Our House, Pathways in Long Beach, New Hope in Long Beach, Gary's Kids down in South Orange County. Get them connected to a group where they can be with peers, where they're not the only kid in school that has experienced a death. Or get somebody to, if you know what school they're in, maybe you can connect with one of the agencies who does school-based groups and get them connected with a school-based group that will come on site and show them who their peers are. So that's mine. Oh, if a parent comes to you and says, should I take my 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 20-year-old, 5-year-old to a funeral, to the hospital? Should I tell them about my cancer? Should I take them to see someone in the ICU? Should I take them to the center? Yes, 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 yes. Dr. Warden's research in children's, when a parent dies, that book out of Harvard, said that children who do best are children that were involved in a funeral or memorial service or involved in the process. The least ones make up ideas about what's happening over in the funeral or the memorial or da-da. They still have to be prepared for what they're going to see and hear. But I do death notification on organ donation kids when there's no child life specialist in the hospital to take care of it, because child life, if there's a child life at that hospital where so-and-so's hospitalized, bring the kids in, get them connected, have them go in, see the machines, and ideally with somebody that's not super close to them, like a distant aunt or maybe their so that their first death exposure is not someone that they're super close with. Take them to the cemetery and talk about who's buried there. It's the people park. Not all parks have people buried under the ground, but this one does, and you can tell because there's names on the ground, okay? And the head is not inside the headstone. You don't chop off the head and put it inside the headstone. That's just the name for the marker. Anyway, Harold Ivan has a great book about all the ways you can describe. I'll let him tell.
Just to underscore, it's really appropriate that you use developmentally appropriate language with dealing with the child. The younger the child, the more concrete you want to be. And then I want to underscore that whole thing about, I grew up under a pastor who used to say, you don't get your right sense until you're 25. Well, neurobiology is caught up. The human brain is not fully integrated until 25 or later. All the connections aren't there. In some of the discussions that are currently going on, I get really frustrated because you look at some of our 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they have very poor impulse control. Their minds are not fully integrated. They're making decisions that they're not prepared to make.
Yeah. Michelle gave me a little prompt. I did write a book called What Does That Mean? It's the basic Children's Illustrated Dictionary of Grief. So it tells what embalm means, what mausoleum is. I thought Joy Johnson and I could do it in about 3 months. How difficult is this? It took 2.5 years. And the only word that's not in there, I wanted, Joy said absolutely not, was hell. Because I said, there are a lot of kids out here that they're hearing something about hell. But it gives them ways, and sometimes parents go, well, I don't exactly know what cremation is, and let's see what the book says. And it jumpstarts conversations. Now, I work as a celebrant for Speaks, and they have given me a great deal of freedom. And I always ask the family, now, how many children are going to be present? And usually there's, how many children are going to be? Yeah. This is a family funeral home. Yeah, we want you to bring your children. And this one woman said, well, they wouldn't know how to act. And I said, oh, we have a lot of people in here who don't know how to act. So and then another woman said, well, what if they ask a question? And I go, well, we'll try to answer it. But I do something in the funerals and memorial services I do. I bring all the children down front of the casket or the urn, and we talk about why they're there, why they're not in school that day. And generally, I read the invisible string to them and then pass out strings. And I show them, now you could make a bracelet out of this, you could make a necklace. And at the end of the service, then, I have some of those children stand by near the casket, and they pass out those strings to everybody that goes by. Saturday, this man I buried, he kept a bowl on top of the refrigerator for candy. So once you got it old enough, you knew where the candy was. Now, you couldn't get to it, but you knew. And so at the end, I asked two of his grandsons, would they come and stand with me at the front? And I said, this is the bowl from the top of my refrigerator. And I said to these two little guys, now make sure everyone who comes by here gets candy. Make sure everybody, nobody gets by you. Well, people were just like, I didn't know you could do that. So my concern is about children being spectators. Can we move to participants? And we have had only one negative to it, and those people were crazy. But so many people just said, and I go, well, Speaks wants to make this a safe place for children. And if they have questions, and I always tell people with babies, do not take that baby out of this funeral. If the baby gets fussy, walk up and down the side aisles. But, I never will have a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild. This man does. And this is part of honoring him. And sometimes people just need to see it modeled. Well, I didn't know you could do that. And no kid is like, flaming out of, oh, my God, what is going on? And it's just been the most wonderful experience. Even with the 3-year-old. I had 21 children down in front with me on the floor around the urn. And it was just an incredible moment I will never forget. And I helped them understand after I read Invisible String, now, you don't have to forget Jace. You can keep him right up here in your mind. And he's always going to be there. And people just went out going, wow, I just didn't know. And there are funeral homes, to be sure, that are not child-friendly. That's and some attitudes toward rituals. But, years ago, when we had Sabbath, blue laws and all that stuff, cemetery was one of the few places you could go to court. So there were always romantic couples in the cemetery. And, because you weren't violating the Sabbath day, and you want to go to the cemetery and maybe,
Interesting. Wow, that puts a whole spin on some things at Forest Lawn I had never thought about. Wow. Okay. It's a great lead into to a couple of questions that are here talking about funeral rituals and talking about new traditions and things, particularly and you alluded to it in your talk, Harold Ivan, this morning about some of the, and I use the word cross-pollinations of rituals and things. I mean, we have been used to in the church, particularly for the more liturgical churches, opening up the prayer book and stuffing somebody's name in it. And because we got these specific prayers and we make our way through this, and God is, God is the center of all of this, and the decedent is barely dealt with. But talk about some of the, if you would, some of the funeral traditions and maybe some of the new things that you're seeing, and you just did that, but I wonder if, you guys can share a little bit, some things that maybe, in particular, Michelle, some of your clients have talked about the things that were really helpful with that. Yeah.
So one of the ones that we've incorporated at OneLegacy, we do these mass memorials where we honor the previous year's donors, and so we might have 20 deceased people represented or 60 deceased people represented. And then now I've seen people do this at a future memorial or funeral, is you place a colored sand that the participants get to choose. They get to choose the color that represents them or represents their connection to the deceased person. And at some point during the ceremony, it becomes participatory, where you have a large vase up front, home goods, cheap, about 15 bucks, beautiful, you know, like that. And they come forward, you use little vials and fill them about halfway. It's also great at weddings, so we do it at weddings too. And then they pour the sand, each person comes up and pours the sand inside the jar that the family gets to take home. Now at our mass memorials, we take them back to our office and we talk about how the grief connects us with each other, but that would be a beautiful ritual you could do in the middle of a church service once a year to honor the deceased from the previous year. It's just so nice, because then it's something that represents your community. You can place it. I just love that, and it comes from the Native American tradition, the sand ceremony. And you say a few words over it that applies, but we love that, and our families love it. And they take pictures before they leave of the jar, since we get to keep the jar.
We do a memorial service once a year, and members of the congregation can send in a picture of their loved one, and those pictures are shown during the remembrance service.
I'm a celebrant, and if you don't know about the celebrant movement, one of the great trainers is In Touch in Oklahoma City. They don't just turn you loose doing funerals and memorial services, but we do very creative things. We have a significant percentage, when they come through the door, they're clear to tell the funeral director, we don't want a preacher, we don't want the priest, we don't want a rabbi. I mean, it's non-negotiable. And so our funeral directors will say, well, now we have a celebrant. What's that? Well, he's kind of like a wedding planner. He'll come out and visit with you and talk to you and help you plan a distinctive service that honors your loved one. And so it's wonderful because it gives creativity. I served brownies the other day in the middle of the service because the deceased had a cabin on the lake, and he came in off the lake in his boat with all of his grandkids. They had brownies, and then they had vanilla ice cream on top of it. Well, it was 107 in the cemetery, and you can't do ice cream. So I said, now, you know, this is Speaks, and we're a family funeral home, and sometimes we do things a little different because we're families. So I want the people to come forward and pass out the brownies. Well, people were just like, you can't do this, and it's true. In some states, you cannot do that. But it captured a particular man who had to have his brownies and ice cream, and making that happen, and still with faith elements in it. What I'm finding is a lot of them don't want to be preached at. You know, because sometimes, a woman the other day told me, well, I said, what are you going to do for music? I want How Great Thou Art. And I went, this family's not religious. And, oh, no. And she goes, every funeral I've ever been to has got How Great Thou Art with Elvis Presley. All right? And sure enough, I had to bite my lips. Oh, Lord, my God. And it was different. It was different, but the family, and when they found out they could bring some elements to it, then suddenly that added a whole, and they go away going, this is the best funeral I think I've been to. Well, because we're making it about them. And even pastors can do this. It's a way of saying, we are burying a particular person. This was their name. This is their story. And I think it's so, because here's what I worry about with children. If grandma dies and nothing is done, it communicates to the child, if I die, nothing will be done for me. And children, their antenna out. They pick up so much stuff. And this is the thing it concerns me about with the violence, some of these children. When you had that part of the film where they raised their hands, you know, they know children that have died. And you know what we know about attachment, what are these young ones going to be like when they get to be 30 if they have grown up with this sense of my life can be taken in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that we do at Forest Lawn, which I actually learned its value my last year as a pastor, but every year in December we do a series of candlelight services, invite the community, invite the folks that we have served, and to come out and to light a candle in the evening time. And we have between 14 services, English and Spanish. We have, well, this last year we had 5,600 people up here. But the last year that I was doing in pastoral ministry, I came across this idea of Blue Christmas. Some of you may have heard of that or seen that. If you haven't, look it up. I had a small congregation. I had about 30 people in it. And when we put together the service, I wasn't expecting very many, and we had like 15 people that came. I had 50 candles. And when it came time for people to come forward and to light the candle and people to remember and honor their loved ones who had died, I almost ran out of candles. And I sat there and I looked. One of those things where you think, oh well, I'm doing something for them, and you get more out of it because of what I learned. I sat there and I looked at this little planter I had full of sand and all these little single white taper candles, and people were standing there and lighting 1 and 2 and 3 candles of people that they were remembering. Maybe it was just this last year. Maybe there were people that had died 10, 15, 20 years ago. They don't forget them. And they put that candle in there, and I looked at the beauty of these candles that were lit, and the need for rituals that we have. The church used to be really, really good with the rituals, and we've gotten pretty poor with it again. We don't think about being ritualistic people, but the church year is set up as a ritual. I would encourage you for All Saints Day, a very simple time. It's built into the church year. It gives you an opportunity to remember those people that have died. After my mom died, I'm kind of getting like Harold Ivan here and just kind of keep going. One thought to the next, and but when my mom died, she was in Texas. She died out here. I brought her out here for her last years with Alzheimer's and taking care of her. And after she died, and buried her in Texas. All Saints Day came around. She was a member of a 7,000 member church back there. You know, they have those in the Midwest, and a lot of them in Texas. And All Saints Day at that 9 a.m. service, they did a necrology of everybody in the congregation that had died in the previous year. And they had the choir singing, and they've got a big 60-member choir and probably a $50,000 organ and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sitting in front of my computer at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning, bawling my eyes out. Because this huge church remembered my mom in a moment. Now, they didn't the next year, and that's fine. But in that year, that first year that came up and everything, to mark and honor the significant loss that her death brought to a few people. My mom was 94. She hadn't lived there in several years. Was incredible, and incredible for me. And I was the only one. I told my sister and my brother that I don't think they watched it, but it was a deep, deep meaning that I can still reach back when I want to experience and express some of that love that I know others have for my mom, that I can touch that moment. And that's an incredible gift from that church. You have that opportunity every year. It comes up. Every year it comes up. And I want to encourage you to.
I want to add on to that. That's a great idea. I saw in, St. Andrew's Presbyterian down in Newport Beach. Mm-hmm. They did one of the most dramatic things. They started with this urn, just in the morning worship service, just this big old urn. And when they got the time, the choir was singing for all the saints who from their labor's rest. They would call the name, and a florist put a rose into this urn. Mm-hmm. And they went through like 70 names. Yep. And it took time.
Yep.
But it was the most incredible moment of calling these names. I think also there's a need in ministry to reach out to those who are having red letter days, where it's their wedding anniversary, a birthday. Even if it's just simple card, this is your first Valentine's Day, thinking of you on this very difficult day.
Yep.
And with computers, you can kind of keep track of that, but that it's great you did all this within like the first 36 hours or first week. But as they live their way into these, having those moments, even just a note, you came to mind today because I know this day is a red letter day on your heart. And I do that. And people have been surprised. How do you know? Well, I keep track of that. That's important. And one family, they said, you never forget. It's been 30 years. You never forget. Everybody else has.
Yep.
But we know you. And it's just a little thing, a little postcard or card, and maybe deputizing people in your ministry who could do that. You are being thought of this special day.
Kenneth, I just kind of following up, I'm wondering if at your congregation, is there anything that you all have seen or discovered or watched develop, again, changing in rituals, in relationship to like a traumatic loss that maybe wouldn't have been there before? Is there anything that maybe comes to mind? Or
nothing that comes to mind. Most Black congregations are fairly traditional. Even Faithful Central is a non-traditional church, but there is a lot of tradition.
Okay.
That's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
No, we don't have tradition. No,
No.
We don't have tradition.
Question here about grieving the loss of a relationship, and especially after divorce or loss of significant relationship where no one has physically died. Is there some comments that you all can bring about that in the sense of?
A really strange thought that comes to mind. I was having this conversation with another therapist. The mistress or the second family, the person who has no legitimate right to grieve, and yet they're grieving. That's what came to mind when you asked
that sense of disenfranchised loss, that the society says, no, you're not acceptable to be experiencing this loss.
I did years of work in the area of divorce, and I think sometimes we push people, rather than do the pain of going through the divorce, to get into a new relationship. And then for some of them, that startling discovery, I didn't do the grief work. And now I'm in this relationship, and I think anything we attach to and we lose, we grieve. A friend of mine closed his counseling practice because his partner was moving. And that sense of loss, I had worked to build this and this confidence, and now I've moved. And what happens, that sense of grief. I think there's a lot of institutional grief, churches, and some churches that were once ablaze, so to speak, and now it's, how do you grieve for a congregation or a community that isn't what it once was? I think we've got to find ways to reach out and to spend a lot of time recognizing all kinds of losses. It counts to you. And one other thing was the one where you thought this relationship was going to make it to marriage, and it didn't. And that sense of coming up to a Christmas and, well, guess what? I'm still single. Or the people who with hope this was the year they were going to get pregnant, and there's going to be a baby's first Christmas. Giving people places to own that grief and to say, can we walk with you in recognizing?
Okay, so since I started with full disclosure, I am maybe the only person on the panel that actually is divorced. Oh, all right, yes. Okay, so this
Okay, I'm the odd one here.
Okay, well,
this is society, by the way, folks.
My parents are still married. Divorce does not happen in the family, so I was the first one. And it was very challenging, but I'm going to stick to the congregation that I was in. My congregation was going through a pastoral change. My pastor actually was divorced and remarried and went through a lot of difficulty at the time in the Presbyterian church to fight to stay ordained. because of the divorce. So, but now he had been married a good 10 years or so, but he had moved on to another congregation. The challenge with congregations where I always say churches have the best people in them and some of the worst people in them. No problem. Okay. So some of the challenges as a parishioner in your congregation is that your parishioners will tell your other parishioners stuff that you and your denomination don't even believe, and it will affect the attendance of your parishioners. So at the time that I had, after 4 years of fighting for this marriage to work and just decided, that's it, final nail in the coffin's gotta happen, which ended up being the best for me and for him in the long run. But I had 2 parishioners who were divorced and happily remarried in my Bible study tell me that it's okay to separate, but I should never divorce because God doesn't like divorce and it's kind of one of those unforgivable sins. And it really affected my ability to worship at that congregation. It didn't affect my relationship with God. And I'm still in touch with my old pastor. He just moved too far away. But I could not be a member of a congregation where 2 other deacons told me, even though they were divorced and happily remarried, that I should live forever married to my husband, but separated. And I cannot tell you the damage that it did to me in being able to stay at that congregation. And I don't know how you resolve that as a pastor, except by really reaching out to the people in your congregation when you know that they're going through something and trying to help them work through their faith so that they know whether they're connected to you and aligned with what your church can do for them. Because these people were saying something that was not a part of the Presbyterian faith. But it affected me, and I didn't have anybody reach out to help me through that process.
In the South, we have a wonderful expression. God love them, they just don't know any better. And then you just go on. And just
bless their pea-picking heart.
Yeah. I want to say something, too, about, you added about the mistress, the number of exes, ex-mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother, sister-in-law, that whole dimension of where does their grief go? And they may have kept a connection because of the children or whatever. And how do we reach out? You're in pain. Because they may still be grieving the death of the relationship.
Yep.
And now this person has died. And helping them with all these relationships. And you just start looking at it, they're just, and some people it's like, you're out of here, you're out of the family, you're not welcome to the visitation. And we've had some awkward moments when someone has arrived. And I've tried to say, they've come to pay their respects, and there's a reason, and let's be hospitable.
Just a quick clinical comment. Most people will work through their grief with their loved ones and their families. If you have a parishioner who's still deeply impacted after 6 months, they probably need some help.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that, all of you, in the sense of what do we see? What can we be aware of to try to recognize that within our congregations, within people?
The clothes are still on the bed. She's been gone 9 months, haven't dealt with it at all. Every time you see them, they break into tears over the deceased individual. 3, 4, 5 months of that is okay. Once you hit the 6 month mark, they need some help.
And I would just say my bias is that they don't need help because there's anything wrong with them and that it's not normal to grieve at 6 months. They just probably don't have enough support around them to foster the continuation of the healing. Because I would say parents grieve 5 years easy if I had to pick a time frame, and that would be, and suicide, trauma, any kind of traumatic death. For children, they don't even feel their real feelings until about 12 months after the death, and the new school doesn't know that they've had a death. The new home doesn't know that they've had a death. So just keep children and teens typically don't, the first year of most people's grief is what they call the white knuckle year, where they're just trying to get through the first year and they're kind of in a fog. The second year, most people will say, is the harder year of grief. So by getting help, I don't mean that they're necessarily clinically depressed and need meds or hospitalization, but a support group would help them feel normal and give them some resources to look at their coping. I forgot what the original question was, but I had something else.
It'll come back.
Yeah.
That's right. Harold, you have something to...
Yeah, I often do a little exercise in which I ask the grievers, especially the first night at the hospital, to look at their thumbs. And some of them are like, we're here at a grief group, and just stare at your thumb a while. Now, would you show your thumb to someone sitting next to you? And they go along with this. Just go along with it. And then I go, I want to tell you why I asked you to do that. There are 7 billion people on planet Earth, and not one of them has a thumbprint like yours. So if your thumbprint is unique, and it is, your grief print will be unique.
Yep.
And anytime somebody tells you you aren't grieving right, just raise that thumb where you see it out of the corner and wiggle it. If my thumbprint is unique, then my grief print will be unique. I want to say a quick word about, we talked about children. The King children, Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott kids, are still very wounded by what did not happen. They sue each other regularly. They keep the lawyers busily suing each other. They were recently thrown out of Fulton County Court in Atlanta. But what happened? Coretta was determined she was going to continue Dr. King's legacy, so she was gone a lot, and the kind of default, over the kids. And someone felt the need to tell Martin III, you're the man of the house now. Oh. You're the man of the house. And Dexter says who? And that has gone to this very day. And now they're fighting over Dr. King's Bible and his Nobel Prize medallion. And one judge lectured him, your parents would be so embarrassed with you. But you also have to understand when their grandmother was shot playing the organ during prayer time at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. They all went to the hospital, and Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. got in the emergency room and said, now everybody listen up to me. We're forgiving the crazy man that shot Big Mama. Does everybody understand me? And he went around to each one of them. And Dexter said, I wasn't about to forgive anybody. They killed Grandma. And he said, my grandfather's eyes hooked on me. Dexter? Yeah, Granddaddy, yeah. And all this work that they were never allowed. And Dexter says very clearly that anytime we were halfway grieving, next thing you know, we were off to Disney. Somebody was taking us somewhere to distract us from our grief. They would not. And then the final thing is the expectations. Oh, you're Dr. King's children. We're expecting a lot from you. And I wish there were a way in their adulthood they could put down all the years and years that's happened. But this happens in other families. Somebody got the punch bowl. Or got this or that, and you go, it wasn't worth anything. You can go to an antique mall and replace it for $29. But it was the fact, no, Mom wanted me to have that. And at the hospital, I love to say, you don't know what kind of family you're in till you settle the estate.
Yep.
And and I said that for years, and then it happened in my family. And I was dumbfounded. I just thought it was a pretty good thing to tell people. Oh my gosh, the pain that came into exist to this day.
Yeah, it's real different when it's personal. Michelle, I think okay, good. I was going to have you.
The difference between normal grief and abnormal grief was the question, I think. So active suicidal ideation is not normal grief. That's something else. So if they're starting to think about wanting to die, how to die, when to die, etc. Passive suicidal ideation, like I wouldn't care if a bus hit me. I wouldn't care if I got cancer. I'm so sad I wouldn't care if God took me. That's really normal. But if you get into active, that is not normal. Hallucinations, as they would call it in therapy, where, oh, I heard grandma talking to me. I feel like I felt his spirit. Oh, I heard his voice. I smelled her. You know, those kinds of things. I think I had a visitation. Very normal. Abnormal is...
Just to say.
Yes?
In some cultures, not only is it normal,
it's expected.
But it's expected.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's how they tell you they love you, right? But abnormal is, Sonny, please kill yourself and join me in heaven. Or kill someone else and help. So command hallucinations is abnormal. You're getting into psychosis. After maybe the 6-month mark, if they're not working, if they haven't gone back to the work, if they're not sleeping, they've got terrible insomnia, or they're sleeping all the time, more than 9 hours a day. If they haven't gone back to normal eating within a good 2 to 3 months, where they're able to, you know, have 3 meals a day, maybe they don't have quite the appetite, or they're gaining large amounts of weight. You're seeing them gain 20, 30, 40 pounds in a 6 to 1 year mark. They're usually numbing out in some way. Drug and alcohol use, you're starting to see some evidence of that. Accidents that aren't making sense, they're not showing up places, they seem really groggy when they show up. You know, they normally were really engaged in the church, and now all of a sudden they're showing up with bruises. It could be they're getting drunk and falling down and overusing. I think those are most of the abnormal versus normal.
Yeah. Would you talk just a little bit before you give that up about kids in particular? I mean, because are there things that we can see? You mentioned about feelings, but most kids, as we know, are somatic grievers and stuff. So what kind of body sorts of things would they be doing, particularly little kids? Because we just think they're okay.
So little kids, you'll see them accident prone. This is also true for adults. The first 12 months after the death of someone close, people are more likely to get minor illnesses and in minor accidents, car accidents, falling down clumsy. It's because they're so overwhelmed in their brain with the grief and their thoughts and their feelings or their adjustments that they're forgetting to pay attention to their environment. So a normally very athletic person might start walking into doorways. That's another reason why you might start seeing bruises show up. Or they'll end up, children particularly, sometimes teens are very somatic in their grief. So they'll have a lot of tummy aches, headaches, body aches that will last a long period of time. They're frequently going to the pediatrician, and you're hearing about this. So we had to stay home from church today because he had another headache or he wasn't feeling well. So those somatic, they kind of pull it into their body because they don't know how to express it out of their body, so they get those physical reactions. But that happens at any age. It's just more common for kiddos.
Yeah. And sometimes you see kids who are really angry. You don't hear any sadness, but they're fighting, and they didn't used to be fighters.
Yeah.
Since it's in the afternoon and those brownies are beginning to set in, and I want to spike it up a bit. You know, I think the last taboo topic in grief is grief and sexuality. And it's just don't go there. And I now wonder, and I wrote a book, I wrote a chapter in a book called Mama's Dead and Daddy's on Viagra. And I was hoping Dolly Parton was going to take an option on the topic, and she didn't. But you know, the sense of, do we talk to grievers? And especially in a church setting, do we see the damage? They've had an affair, or there's a huge blow up, and then we have to deal with it. And walking into people and understanding these differences, men and women, some men only know how to be tender in sex and to be vulnerable. And so they're making a move, and the wife goes, "Are you nuts? Our child's just been dead 3 months, and now you want sex." Well, no, he wanted tenderness, and he wanted a bridge, and helping them understand, especially I think with teenagers who act out sexually. It doesn't start out to have sex, but it's touching, being held, and the church has to get over our squeamishness and wander in. And, you know, we ask, are you eating? Are you sleeping? But I think we need to move in cautiously, but to ask, how are things going intimacy-wise? that sense of it just has to be dealt with because the consequences can be enormous. I think some of these men do not, the men who have affairs after our death, they didn't start out to have an affair. It was somebody listened to me. I could talk to this person at work, and you know, they listened, and there are things I can't tell my wife now, or vice versa. And somehow what started with the ears ends up being a genital experience. And now you've got a whole nother realm of problem. And I think the churches have to say, let's walk into it gingerly, but nevertheless walk into it.
If husbands and wives aren't careful, they'll wind up feeling very lonely after a death. And that's when somebody swoops in, when one of them is feeling really lonely and vulnerable.
And since I am the woman, I will say women have affairs too.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I appreciate that the men up here were kind and blamed all you men in the audience, but I will say that women have affairs after because they also are not getting the tenderness that they need. Or widows or widowers that think about it in your own life. You feel so alive when you're engaged in a sexual, intimate experience. And when you've been exposed to trauma or you've been exposed to a death, some of the reaction to that is, how can I feel alive? So there can be this desire, even in a, I feel guilty, like I'm betraying my wife that died or my husband that died. But it's the only thing I can think of that's going to make me feel alive. So how do they deal with that in their spiritual belief practice and in their, I've had widows tell me that they don't want the man to talk, they just want sex. They don't want to date, they don't want a relationship, they don't want to start cooking and cleaning again, but they want sex because it helps them feel alive. And we don't give them a whole lot of space to talk about that when we're coming to them from a spiritual perspective because of all the sin and shame and I don't know.
Of course you can say one more
I
thing.
want to thank you for coming. Sometimes you've been to these before and you go, oh, it was good last year, I'll go. And this year, I think it's the first one.
This is the first year.
So you were kind of doing this, let's see how it works. And I want to thank Azusa, I want to thank Forest Lawn, because I do some of these that are not quite first class. And, the food, they go, well, they must have used the food money to pay the speaker. And then they growl at me in the afternoon because they think I got it all. But this was so quality and giving one of my resources. And I hope this is just the first of a long chain of conferences you do. I'm so pleased to have been part of it. Thank you.